Climate Hustle 2: Rise of the Climate Monarchy is a hot item. The hard-hitting video documentary expose, the frauds, the hypocrisies, and the tyrannous plans that tie climate alarmism to the World Economic Forum's Great Reset, and government-mandated lockdowns in response to the coronavirus pandemic. And it does it all with a combination of biting humor, shrewd logic, and hard facts. Tonight, our friend Marc Morano, co-executive producer of Climate Hustle 2, will be our guest to discuss the film and responses to it. Marc heads up ClimateDepot.com, one of the best websites debunking the exaggerated claims of catastrophic man-made global warming. Stay with us and invite your friends to join you. Hi, I'm Megan Kennard, Director of Operations and Communications for the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. Thank you for joining us on From the Stacks, our weekly live stream. The Cornwall Alliance is a 501c3 nonprofit that promotes biblical earth stewardship, economic development for the poor, and the gospel of Jesus Christ. You can learn more about us at www.cornwallalliance.org. We have a very interesting show for you tonight, so I hope you'll take a minute to share this live stream and invite your friends to join us. I will be monitoring the comments on both Facebook and YouTube, so if you have a question, write a comment and I'll try to answer those questions while we're live. Before we dive into tonight's program, I want to mention that all the past episodes of From the Stacks are available not only on our Facebook page, but also on YouTube, which means your friends who don't use Facebook can still see them. Just go to the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation's YouTube channel. There you can see any of our past interviews, like last week's Surviving the Pandemic and the Panic That Turned It Into a Catastrophe with Dr. Jay Richards, or Getting a Grasp on Climate Change, Climate Models, and Climate Predictions with Dr. Roy Spencer, or What's in Store from Biden-Harris Energy Policy with H. Sterling Burnett, and many more. Now here's Cal Beisner to introduce tonight's topic.
I can't hear him.
Cal, I don't think we have your sound.
I'm sorry. You know, I had my mic muted. Let me start over. Tonight should be fun, despite my problems. Marc Morano's a hard-hitting, fiery kind of a guy, an old friend of mine and one of the best informed people I know about climate change and climate and energy policy. Tonight we're talking with him about his new film, Climate Hustle 2: Rise of the Climate Monarchy, which you can receive free on DVD when you make a donation to the Cornwall Alliance of literally any size by the end of this month and request it. All you have to do is go to cornwallalliance.org, donate now, that's /donate now, fill out the donation form, and in the comments field, ask for Climate Hustle 2 or mention promo code 20-12. Marc Morano began his career working for Rush Limbaugh, of all people, and I think Rush kind of rubbed off on him. Marc later served as Director of Communications for Senator James Inhofe, author of the book The Greatest Hoax: How the Global Warming Conspiracy Threatens Your Future. While working in the Senate, Marc also served as Communications Director for the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. I think that was the first time Marc and I ever met. I was called to testify before the committee as an expert witness on the ethics and economics of climate and energy policy. And if I remember correctly, Marc had a hand in facilitating that event. I'd been warned in advance that Senator Barbara Boxer, Democrat from California and a hardened climate alarmist, would do her best to undermine my credibility. After pointing out that I was at the time an adjunct scholar of the Acton Institute on Religion and Liberty, Senator Boxer asked me, "Are you aware that the Acton Institute receives financial support from ExxonMobil?" I looked her in the eye and said, "Yes, Senator, and I'm also aware that argumentum ad hominem circumstantial is a logical fallacy." Well, my response had exactly the effect I'd hoped. She stared blankly at me for a good 15 seconds, like a deer caught in the headlights, And finally, she began shaking her head and saying, well, I don't know what all that academic gobbledygook means, but, and then she went off on a tirade about global warming. Well, friends of mine in the back of the room later told me it was all they could do to keep from bursting out laughing. Argumentum ad hominem circumstantial, by the way, is the logical fallacy of thinking that because someone stands to gain from the truth of the conclusion of his argument, you needn't answer his reasons. Try that one on your oncologist when he diagnoses you with cancer and recommends treatment. I could have added, by the way, that it had been over a decade since I'd received any money from the Acton Institute, and then I had just been paid $500 for delivering 3 lectures at a conference in California that took 5 days out of my time. So this was our introduction to Marc Morano and me knowing each other. But enough about me. Marc Morano is one of the most articulate, hard-hitting critics of climate alarmism on the planet. He wrote the book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change. He runs climatedepot.com, a great website that will help keep you up with all the developments in the science and politics of global warming. He has the keenest eye of anyone I know for detecting climate alarmists' inconsistencies, factual errors, and hypocrisies. And most recently, he starred in and led in producing Climate Hustle 2, Rise of the Climate Monarchy, a new documentary video that you simply must see. So, Marc Morano, welcome to From the Stacks.
Thank you, Cal. Happy to be here. Appreciate this opportunity. And yes, I remember well your testimony before the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. And I remember Senator Barbara Boxer just being literally floored and just went right over her head, your response to her. And it was a very funny moment. But she did that to all the witnesses. She took this prosecutorial style, and she always tried to accuse everyone of some kind of evil funding. And she did that, and you were one of the few that escaped her style because she owns that setting. She commands the rules and tries to intimidate, but you were one of the few witnesses that escaped and was able to turn the tables on her.
Well, it was fun. Marc, the climate alarmist website desmogblog.com calls you the Matt Drudge of climate denial, the king of the skeptics, and a central cell of the climate denial machine. Rolling Stone magazine listed you as one of the 17 top climate killers. What do you have to say for yourself? Why would anyone in his right mind pay any attention to you? Don't you know that an overwhelming scientific consensus, over 97% of the world's climate scientists, think what you say is utter nonsense?
Well, that's interesting. Thank you for this opportunity. Yeah, I am not a scientist, but I like to say I occasionally play one on TV, and that drives them nuts. I got the opportunity to debate Bill Nye 3 times, twice in primetime television, once on CNN and once on Fox. But what I'd like to say, what I like to think of myself, I'm a investigative.
Marc, that's Bill Nye, the science guy, who also is not a scientist, right?
No, he's Bill Nye, the engineer. Bill Nye, the jail the skeptics guy. He's the one who's now advocating, along with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., that we jail climate skeptics. But what I like to say, and they always say, well, what credibility do you have? I actually work with the scientists. And when I wrote my book, when I did my movie first and second, when I worked in the U.S. Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, I was in daily contact and am in daily contact with a whole host of scientists. So I like to think of myself as sort of the voice of the scientists who are dissenting on man-made global warming. And as a researcher, I try to bring that in. So the reason they go all and attack me is because I'm out there in their face. I'm out there exposing them on a daily basis, and they don't like it. In fact, they come after me probably more than just about any other skeptic at the moment. And they're relentless with their attacks.
Yeah, back at the time that you worked with the EPW committee, you generated a huge report that listed hundreds of scientists who criticized the so-called consensus. You not only had their names, but you had extensive quotes from them that were contradicting all kinds of claims by the climate alarmists. Tell us a little bit about those reports real quickly. And are they still available, by the way?
Yes, they are. And interestingly enough, they're hard to find on the Senate website. So I've moved them over to my website, Climate Depot. But what happened was Gore's film came out in 2006, and then the UN report the year later. And literally, this was the big watershed moment in the media. All scientists agree, 97%. There's no dissent. There are people who believe, the UN chief had said, these are people who believe that the Earth is flat or the moon landing was staged. That's all that's left. They also don't believe in climate change or global warming. So, in consultation with Senator Inhofe, I set about to put up a compilation of the dissenting scientists from around the world. Our first report came out with 400 prominent scientists that included former United Nations scientists, scientists from MIT, from University of Pennsylvania, Ivy League institutions, Nobel Prize winning scientists. We put this report out, 400 scientists. Then we went to 750, eventually over 1,000 dissenting scientists. And it was the report that rocked the climate debate. Even on Fox News, people like Bill O'Reilly, who had previously been talking about, starting to bend on climate change and not wanting to push back. Once we had this report out, even the skeptics got stronger because we had the names, quotes, affiliation, background, their papers, and there was a whole range of perspectives on science. In other words, the oceanographers believed ocean cycles ruled the climate. The solar scientists believed it was the sun. The geologists believed it was natural carbon dioxide cycles. So it was an amazing report that we did. Senator Inhofe went to the Senate floor, read it aloud. It was just a huge report, and we followed up. And that is where the basis for the pushback on this whole global warming, really the modern pushback, began. Because up until that point, there was really, it was more of a few disparate scientists and bloggers talking. We tried to coalesce it all into one big report.
Mark, Sir David Attenborough, whose lavish BBC nature films have mesmerized millions of viewers, said about climate change, if we don't take action, the collapse of our civilizations and the extinction of much of the natural world is on the horizon. Do you just not care about civilization or the natural world? Is that why you think as you do about climate change?
Yeah, interesting. David Attenborough has been saying things like that now for more than a decade. And what's interesting is in my book, we go back to 1864, the exact same dire climate tipping points. They warn of climatic excess. Professors in 1864 that we must do something. The United Nations is on record in the 1980s, the same kind of rhetoric as Attenborough, that we must act before it's too late. NASA's lead global warming scientist, James Hansen, said we had Obama's first term before it was too late. Prince Charles gave us famously 100 months and then did the countdown and then said, forget it, I'll give you 35 more years. So Attenborough is a string of what you would call environmental Cassandras, if you will. They scream, they try to get attention, and it completely fails every time they do it. And interestingly enough, he's in deep trouble because he did a Netflix documentary where they claim that walruses were jumping over cliffs due to climate change. And astute researchers found that it was an actual thing that had been going on, recorded records going back decades, that there was nothing new or unique about it and had nothing to do with climate change.
Yeah. So you don't think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was right when she said a couple of years ago, we're like, the world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change?
Yes, she was the most recent, just coming out and saying that. And this is, it's hard to even take it seriously because you can go back and the Earth is literally serially doomed if this is the case. Paul Ehrlich, the overpopulation guru in the 60s, made very similar predictions. Here's the key, Cal. In 1968, 1970, they made predictions about resource scarcity, famines, overpopulation, global cooling, that they were 10 years, 12 years, sometimes less than that years away. They all lived to see them fail. So the climate activists now have taken that lesson. Oftentimes you'll see predictions well beyond when someone's going to, well beyond a natural lifespan, so they don't have to be held accountable. But in the case of AOC, she's going with 12 years. At one point, she tried to claim she was joking, and then everyone produced the video evidence. And then, she's tried to back away from her she was joking claim. But we always get this. Al Gore, of course, is the most famous tipping point activist. But I actually document hours of tipping points, minutes, days, weeks, months, years, decades. They've tried every time scale in order to scare people into climate action.
Well, Mark, a few years ago, you and your colleagues with the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow produced the documentary Climate Hustle. Are they trying to control the climate for you? Tell us about that film. What was its main point and how was it received?
Yes, thank you. That was our 2016 film. In other words, part one. The new movie we have
Right.
out is Climate Hustle
Mm-hmm.
2. But Climate
Right.
Hustle 1 dealt chiefly with the science, Megan. And what we showed in that film, we interviewed, again, Nobel Prize winning scientists. We have the UN scientists and scientists with hundreds of peer-reviewed studies, people that they can't say, oh, this is, these weren't people that knew that these were experts in climate who actually contributed to the United Nations reports. What they showed
Mm-hmm.
is that the climate is controlled like hundreds of factors. The idea that carbon dioxide is the control knob of the climate, as in the words of one scientist in the film, quote, scientific nonsense. The idea that we can, at the margins, try to fiddle with one aspect of our climate, CO2, carbon dioxide, which humans inhale oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. They're trying to claim that we can regulate that and somehow get a climatic predictable outcome and regulate storms and bad weather and floods and hurricanes. We go through that in the first film and we lay waste to the scientific case. We go into the extreme weather, hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, wildfires. On every measure, there is either no trend or declining trends on climate time scales. And we also go into the history of this climate doom. And we actually compare it. We have a Harvard astrophysicist, Sally Baliunas, comparing the climate blame game. In other words, our SUV caused that storm, or that coal plant caused this, or our modern way of life is creating all this evil, to the old accusations of witchcraft. And we actually go through very, very clearly and show that it's about as scientific as accusing the witches of changing the weather in the Middle Ages. So the first film was received very well. We also went into the intimidation, and we're seeing that continue today. Scientists who speak out have their careers ruined. They get defunded by the government.
Right.
They get intimidated. They get silenced. And now in the modern era, of course, they're being shut down on all sorts of social media platforms.
Right. Well, now you've
So
come
not
out with
within
Climate
400
Hustle
theaters.
2. Mm-hmm.
Yes, the first movie was in
Climate Hustle
400
2.
theaters. Sure.
Uh-huh. Go ahead.
And Climate Hustle 2 was set to be in almost 800 theaters. Our first film, Climate
Oh,
Hustle
wow.
1 in 400 theaters, was the #1 per screen average that night, beating things like Dracula versus Frankenstein. But this film was going to be almost double the theaters, Climate Hustle 2. But of course, the COVID lockdowns came, and so we had to release it online in September.
Wow. Well, what do you mean by the climate monarchy? The title's Climate Hustle 2: Rise of the Climate Monarchy. What does that mean exactly?
Yes, well, Climate Hustle 2, the first one dealt with the science. The second one deals with the why, the agenda behind it. And so we actually open at King Louis the 14th Palace in Versailles, France, where I actually in costume, and we're explaining how this is the modern climate movement. Essentially, you have an elite ruling class, whether it's the World Economic Forum, whether it's United Nations, whether it's people like John Kerry or Al Gore or Leonardo DiCaprio, or our politicians, or those in academia who are just raking this in and going to all these exotic conferences. They're the ruling class. They don't follow the rules themselves. They live lavishly without regard to any of the restrictions they want to place on the rest of us. They want to make our energy more expensive. They want to limit our airline travel. They want to limit our automobile choices. They want to limit all this, but they themselves won't be affected by this. And that's one of the key things of the climate monarchy. So we go through a history of the monarchy, and we show that. And we also, in this film, go into the whole United Nations agenda. And we go in and we show you that the United Nations is in a unique position, Megan. In 1988, they
Mm-hmm.
formed their climate panel. They not only got to, they examined whether carbon dioxide was going to harm the climate, rising carbon dioxide, whether it was a control knob. They had every incentive to keep finding that it was going to be a catastrophe, because if they failed, they had ceased to have a reason to exist, number one. And number two, if they succeeded constantly, and as Al Gore says, the UN reports are torqued up, which we feature in the film, They then get to be in charge of the solution. And the solution, of course, is the Copenhagen, the Kyoto, the UN Paris Agreement. And as we go forward, more and more agreements. And every time they do these agreements, they announce that we've saved the earth until the next agreement. And when they say, oh, the last one it was woefully unnecessary and we're still in peril, we need to save the earth again. And so that's what Climate Hustle 2 goes through. We go through in deep, go to the funding aspects, the ideology behind it. The UN climate chief has said, we seek a centralized transformation that will make life on planet Earth very different. That's a direct quote. And that's what they're after. So we go through and we show that, and we show how that relates also to the Green New Deal and the whole agenda behind it. The entire Green New Deal is based on the United Nations Sustainable Development Agenda, which came out of the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. It is an amazing carbon copy of that, where every aspect of your lives will be Sovietized. And what I mean by that is just think of East Germany or the old Soviet Union system, where every aspect of your life will be regulated and masterminded from above by people behind the scenes, by so-called experts. We're seeing that now with COVID, where you can't even have a backyard barbecue or a Thanksgiving or a Christmas party or leave your house after a certain time. This is the official Sovietization of America. And that's why I traveled to interview Václav Klaus in the Czech Republic. He grew up under communism. He calls him what the climate agenda the greatest threat to liberty we face today.
Well, to emphasize this for our viewers, this climate monarchy, it's not just climate scientists, it's not even primarily climate scientists. Who is it?
Well, it's the United Nations officials, it's Hollywood celebrities, it's these politicians who literally go to all these conferences, who make up and impose these regulations. We have now cities and states across the America and the world now declaring climate emergencies. President Biden is being urged to declare a national climate emergency. Now think about that for a second. When you declare a COVID a national emergency, it meant you could suspend all sorts of civil liberties. Biden is being done the same thing. Think of a king, a monarch during a time of war. They get to suspend even more liberties because it's for the greater good, and everyone must sacrifice, not the monarchs, but everyone else must sacrifice, the little people. And that's what we delve into in the film with the history of the monarchy, and we show how this climate monarchy is going to be played out in the climate agenda and even the COVID agenda.
So, Mark,
Lockdown agenda.
Name some names. Who are these folks? The politicians, the entertainers. Who are they?
Well, some of
Specifics.
one of the most fun aspects of this, in terms of exposing the hypocrisy of this monarchy, you have Al Gore, Leonardo DiCaprio, Arnold Schwarzenegger. You have James Cameron, who's one of my favorite figures in this. He's one of the wealthiest people in Hollywood. Of course, he did Titanic and a whole host of other films. But he talks in there about, people have to learn to do. We have to be able to do with less. He's quoted in the Los Angeles Times. This is a man who owned a submarine, who owns helicopters, who has massive homes, who flew down to Brazil with other Hollywood actors to stop a hydroelectric dam from being built for people that are barely at subsistence level. And then he flies back home to California. So this is the new monarchs. It's Hollywood, but it's also all these professors in academia. Another one would be people like Michael Mann, the Penn State professor, Michael Oppenheimer. These are people trying to impose their world vision on people who aren't going to have a say in this. In other words, the average person in Africa, in the developing world, 1 billion people don't have running water and electricity. They're going to have a climate agenda imposed on them from the United Nations, from the EU, from the World Economic Forum, without having a say. So they're going to have continued lack of access to running water, electricity, high infant mortality rates. And then, of course, in the United States, people are going to continue to pay higher electric bills as the Green New Deal, as we re-enter the UN Paris. Every aspect of this is masterminded. Every aspect of this is done by a very small group of what you would call monarchs, elitists, however you want to phrase that term. But and it's also the media. The media is a big cog in this wheel of the climate monarchy.
Yeah. One of your chief complaints in Climate Hustle 2 is that leading spokespersons for the climate alarm, politicians, entertainers, even scientists, aren't living the kinds of lives they insist everyone else should live if we're to prevent climate change from devastating the Earth. If excuse me, just a moment. So you've named a few of these. Maybe you could just name a few others as well.
Well, one of the ones we have a
Or
lot of
some
fun with is Barbara
politicians.
Streisand. Now,
Ah,
Barbara Streisand, first of all, she is the one that declared a climate emergency. She's one of the originators of that term, climate emergency. She's also funded UN lead authors to the tune of, nearly $1 million to the Environmental Defense Fund. She is a huge proponent, the perfect example of a monarch, because in the film, we show where she flew her dogs to a concert in England, I believe it was, where it had the carbon footprint, of the average 20 times the average American just for one flight of her dogs. And this is how the climate monarchs do it. They want to impose this. They're funding it. They're in charge of it. They're getting everyone else to impose dire restrictions on our economic choices. At the same time, they basically do whatever they want. Other politicians, as we go forward right now, just looking at the Biden administration, the biggest one who we're going to be dealing with, if Biden is in fact sworn in here, is going to be John Kerry. John Kerry, at one point when he was running for president, couldn't even remember how many homes he owned. Now, remember, he was married to Teresa Heinz Kerry, and he married into even a lot of wealth. So you can't really blame him. I don't know. He doesn't have a list of all the different vacation homes they have. But these are the kind of people who are going to be telling us we have to do with less. These are perfect examples, and we show them in the film, of climate monarchs.
this is the same John Kerry who, back when he was speaking as Secretary of State in Indonesia, made the brilliant scientific observation that the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was about a quarter-inch thick layer of carbon dioxide right out near the edge of the atmosphere, above the stratosphere, whereas actually CO2 is mixed all through the atmosphere. I mean, this is a man who just doesn't get the science at all, and yet he is going to be Biden's climate czar at a cabinet level position.
He is. And another one in the movie, by the way, is Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I want to mention this. He actually tells people in the film that you have to air dry your clothes outside. Don't use a modern washer dryer. Air dry them out there, because you'll save so many tons of CO2. You can lower your carbon footprint. Now, this is no joke, Cal. When he said this, he was daily commuting to the governor's mansion from his mansion in California. In other words, the governor's mansion was a step down for Arnold Schwarzenegger's lifestyle. So this is what he was telling Californians: air dry your clothes outside to lower your carbon footprint. Hey, but don't mind me. I'm going to be flying in a daily jet, commuting by daily jet to the governor's mansion every day. That is a classic climate monarch move.
Wow. Well, what about Bill Nye, the science guy? You've had some interesting encounters with him, haven't you? Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah, Bill Nye, the science guy, has been, it's interesting evolution. He originally wanted to challenge skeptics, and he agreed to debate me on CNN, and we did one other debate on John Stossel. Well, then he didn't get great reviews from his debate, because no one expected actual climate skeptics to push back on their scientific claims. So then he led a campaign starting at CNN, and it actually was very effective, to ban all climate deniers. And even when Will Happer, President Trump's science advisor, made 200 peer-reviewed studies, considered the foremost expert on the greenhouse effect, it was invited on CNN. Bill Nye goes on to smear him. But Bill Nye literally thinks that we can fix the climate the same way we can fix potholes or pave a street. It's just an engineering problem. You go in and you adjust some taxes and spending. We have to give up our lifestyles. We have to pay a lot more. Government's got to get intrusive. You have to do the entire wish list of the progressive left. And guess what? The climate will improve if we do that. It's amazing, even in Bill Nye's world, how the vision of the climate solutions mirror the vision the progressive left has had for the last 50 years. And the other interesting thing about Bill Nye is he literally thinks that climate skeptics should be thrown in jail. I read him the quote during my interview of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who wants to see climate skeptics at The Hague with all the other war criminals getting 3 square meals in a cot, 3 hots in a cot, in the words of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the environmental activist. And Bill Nye is actually open to that and thinks that this is a disservice and that climate skeptics are affecting his quality of life, was the exact quote. So that's Bill Nye. And this is what we're dealing with. Again, another sort of example of a climate monarch who's imposing his view on everyone else and claiming that he's got some higher truth that he has that no one else can see, that he's smarter than everyone else.
But Mark, you're not a climate scientist. Your degree is in political science. You admitted that early in the program. What makes you think you have a right, or anybody else has a right, to speak out so confidently on this subject?
Interestingly enough, that's a great point. I always say my background is in political science, which is the perfect background to evaluate climate change, because the climate change that we're hearing about from academia, the media, the United Nations is not a scientific movement. This is a political lobbying organization movement that is using the face of climate science to essentially get the same measures and policies they've been trying since the 1960s. And actually in the film, we go through it. It's about wealth redistribution. That's their primary goal. You don't need to be a climate scientist to understand the United Nations when they're doing that. It's about sovereignty limiting treaties. This is what is behind this whole thing. And if you look at the claims, when I give speeches, I actually have it all, the newspaper headlines. Climate change will cause more hurricanes, less hurricanes, more floods, less floods, more malaria, less malaria, more fog, less fog. I go through the entire thing. So literally you find out at the end of this, when we're talking dozens and dozens on the main central tenets, global warming will cause more snow, less snow, that they've literally had predictions on both sides of the coin. In other words, whatever happens, they can confidently say, we predicted it. So if you go in and you're at the Super Bowl and you predict both teams are going to win, guess what? When you're Monday morning quarterbacking at the water cooler, you can say, hey, I predicted it. That's what climate science has devolved into. And you don't need to be a climate scientist to poke holes in this pomposity.
Well, Mark, I have a follow-up question for you about that. But first, let me remind our viewers that they can receive a free DVD of Climate Hustle 2 as our way of saying thanks when they donate any amount between now and the end of this month. All they need to do is go to cornwallalliance.org, click the donate button, complete the donation form, and in the comments field, which is on page 2 of the donation form, write Climate Hustle 2 or just promo code 20-12. But Mark, shouldn't people take the word of the world's foremost body of climate scientists on this, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change?
Good question. And that you get that all the time. In fact, John Kerry has famously said, these are the world's top scientists. This is the gold standard of science. Well, if it's actually fool's gold, because the United Nations Climate Panel, each country gets to nominate their scientist, essentially. And what ends up happening is you're only going to the early reports were actually, some of them, I think the first couple reports actually had a lot of good science and a lot of climate skeptics involved. Well, they realized early on, we can't let that happen. So they were tossed out. They were not made welcome. John Christie, a skeptical climate scientist, says he would sit around at a table at these UN, IPCC, the climate body meetings. And the other scientists would say, how are we going to make this report? We have to make this report so alarming, the world will have to act. So they'd sit there and basically come up with the most scarce scenarios. But essentially, we had a thing called ClimateGate that came out in 2010, late 2009 into 2010. And this exposed the United Nations Climate Panel as nothing more than a small cadre of people essentially running a political campaign on climate. They were crushing dissent, not allowing the studies to be published, threatening journal editors who published them, crushing any papers that didn't fit the narrative. And they were destroying careers, and they were actually trying to avoid Freedom of Information Act requests. And I devote a whole chapter to this, and we mentioned this also in Climate Hustle 1 and 2. I think we actually go into ClimateGate and Climate Hustle 1. But this shows that the top echelon of the United Nations, was literally a campaign organization that was far from anything scientific. My favorite quote was by an observer of this, a scientist in the UK, who said, "This is a political organization masquerading as a science body. This has nothing to do with a scientific method." And how the United Nations gets cited as some kind of a scientific authority, it just boggles the mind. And if you look at who the lead authors are, a guy named Michael Oppenheimer, this is a man who literally goes on all sides of the issue. He predicted, snow would be a thing of the past, essentially, in the New York Times, and then he's proven completely wrong. And then they come out and, along with Al Gore, they'll claim, well, guess what? Snow, blizzards, and record snow are actually a consequence of global warming. Again, they try to have it both ways in all of this, but the United Nations is probably one of the most discredited scientific panels now, and you can just talk to the former scientists who used to be part of it. They call it one of the greatest scientific scandals, the ClimateGate scandal, and it is an organization who even Al Gore admits, quote, torques up the science. Al Gore says, how else is the UN going to get the attention of policymakers? Two other points: the former chair of the IPCC, this UN climate panel that won the Nobel Peace Prize, by the way, didn't win a science prize, it was a political prize. But the former chairman actually said, global warming is my religion. Direct quote. He also said, our panel, climate panel of the United Nations, serves at, quote, the beck and call of governments. We produce products. In other words, if the governments want to say there's a climate crisis because they like the solutions, by golly, the United Nations climate panel will produce those solutions. Not unlike our national climate assessments, Megan. The last national climate assessment, which inexplicably the Trump administration allowed to go through, was headed by Obama's former lead negotiator for the UN Paris Agreement, Andrew Light, included two scientists from the Union of Concerned Scientists, a far left-wing progressive environmental group. They were the lead authors on this. So this is how it happens. These are written by environmental activists. They sound like they should belong in newsletters, both the UN and National Climate Assessment. That's how they craft the sausage known as the 97%. And by the way, even UN scientists who looked at the 97% claims, which the UN likes to tout, say that there's absolutely that 97% number was pulled from thin air. There's no science to support it. It's not a credible number in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah. And there's a great moment in Climate Hustle 2, Mark, when you have a good friend of mine, the economist Dr. Ross McKittrick, who's been an expert reviewer for the IPCC since the 1990s, saying this, and I quote, the IPCC process, I would describe it as, it looks to me like when a magician does a card trick and you're watching him shuffle, you think he's totally shuffling the cards, and actually he's not shuffling them at all. And he knows exactly where the card is that he needs to be on top at the end. The IPCC review process is like that. It looks like a really big formal review process with hundreds of people poring over the data. It's nothing like that. And there's the scoop from the inside. Well, Climate Hustle 2
In fact,
is, go ahead, Mark.
Well, I was going to say, in fact, the summary for policymakers, which is all anyone hears about, has to be agreed to line by line by politicians and UN delegates and bureaucrats. That's the scientific process. In other words, it has to fit their narrative, or they just toss the information out, or they bury it into the body of the report. And so, interestingly enough, the UN reports do report accurately in the body, deep inside, that no one talks about, that hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, droughts are not actually increasing on climate timescales, and in many cases declining, but you'd never know it because they're buried deep into the reports. And that's what McKittrick said is exactly right. And it's a whole narrative. One of the ways they do these card tricks is they'll say, like, for instance, polar bears. Polar bears are at or near historic population highs, Cal. They've never counted this many polar bears. Their numbers have exploded. In Al Gore's first film in 2006, Inconvenient Truth, he made the polar bears the poster child of climate change. He did a sequel in 2017, No mention, not a single reference to polar bears. Why not? Because their numbers have exploded. But if you talk to a climate campaigner, a UN scientist, they'll say, well, it's even more dire than we thought for the polar bears. You're like, how? There's more than ever. Well, our predictions of 50 to 100 years are now much more dire than they used to be. The polar bear is doomed based on our climate models. That's how they get it. That's a sleight of hand, another card trick that Ross McKittrick's referring to.
Yeah. Well, Climate Hustle 2 is, I found it a very entertaining film, much of it pretty funny, but it also offers a lot of good science from some of the world's top experts on global temperature change, extreme weather, sea level rise, polar ice melt, as you just mentioned, polar bears, all kinds of things.
Yes.
But those things aren't really the main concern of this movie. It's to warn the public about the threat that climate alarmism poses to our cherished liberties. You draw some lessons from George Orwell's novel 1984 and the movie
Yes.
made from it. How does climate alarmism threaten liberty specifically? Not just for, say, climate skeptics like you and me, who have been threatened with jail time by the likes
Yeah.
of Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, but for just ordinary Americans. How does this threaten their liberty?
Well, actually, we opened the film talking about the COVID lockdowns could morph to the climate lockdowns. Now, that's that's the starkest example I can give you to start with. As I mentioned, President-elect, if you want to call him that, I don't even know, yeah, whatever. If Joe Biden is sworn in, he is being urged to declare a climate emergency. What will come with the climate emergency is very similar to the lockdowns, restrictions on travel, restrictions on economic activity. One of the things that came out of these UN summits I go to every year, and I've been to all over the world, including Bali and Kenya and South America and Europe, is they call for planned recessions in order to fight global warming. And there's a major climate activists who attend these conferences at presentations. What is a lockdown but a planned recession in order to, but a government enforced recession, essentially a planned recession to crush the economy. So the way people are going to be affected is every aspect of your life in the climate agenda, from your home heating, your thermostat setting, your appliances, washer, dishwasher, your dryer, your vehicle choice, your diet. There's a whole campaign against meat eating. In the film, we talk all about how the United Nations is trying to ban meat eating. One of the UN officials actually said we had to make the cost of meat skyrocket. Another said we need to treat meat eaters like we used to treat smokers and give them their own section in a restaurant. Al Gore is trying to be the world's first fake meat billionaire, had the largest IPO meeting time with the UN report on meat to put in these vegetable oil synthesized fake meat burgers, and Al Gore's got one of the big companies on that. So from your diet to your transportation to your choice of work to the size of your house to whether you can own a car. We had Andrew Yang, the Democratic presidential candidate, say out loud and for the record that car ownership may be a thing of the past, that we, instead of owning your own car, the internal combustion engine, we're going to have a roving fleet of electric cars made available to the public. Elizabeth Warren doesn't want home building to continue unless it's, earth friendly and meets certain criteria of the Green Building Code. And that's also going to be part of the Green New Deal. The World Economic Forum, as part of their climate Great Reset agenda, has said, and this is in their video still up, they've actually moved this around and tried to delete it, but it actually says in their vision, their utopian vision of 2030, you will own nothing, but you will be happy. They want to address climate change. The U.S. will no longer be the world's leading superpower. Meat eating will be an occasional treat. This is all part of that agenda. And I bring up the COVID lockdowns again. We've never experienced in the United States, outside of slavery, segregation, and maybe Japanese did during the internment, this kind of restrictions on our liberty. It's unprecedented for a society-wide liberty restriction. Imagine them taking the lesson, declaring a climate emergency, and continuing down that path with all of this stuff that they've been building and planning for decades. And that's what the movie shows. We have a scientist from NYU, actually not a bioethicist, Matthew Lau, in the film, as you know, Cal, you've seen it, who talks about shrinking humans, about giving us a meat patch so that we don't, want to eat meat. It'll make you sick if you eat meat because it's not earth friendly. He wants to genetically shorten people, put in drugs to make infants smaller, interfere with the growth plates in children so they don't get that big, because smaller humans equal smaller carbon footprints. This is what we are facing. And this isn't right-wing conspiracy. We actually put on the screen, as you well know, the name, their quotes, their faces, the actual information, so people can see this and be just eyes open at what the climate hustle is all about.
Wow. Well, you make a point of quoting a famous line from 1984. He who controls the present controls the past. He who controls the past controls the future. How is that relevant to the climate controversy?
Well, we have a whole, in addition to the Monarch theme, we have a whole 1984 theme going through this. And that is relevant because what's happened is in several areas, in the Arctic, the global warming pause, and these have actually been subject to congressional investigations, and we actually mentioned this in the film, they alter the data to suit them. In other words, if you go back to the year 2000 and look at NASA data, it shows the 1930s as warmer than current data in the continental US. Well, they made some adjustments and they cooled the past while they enhanced the warming of the present. So now the 1930s show a warming trend where 20 years ago they didn't. If you go to the year 2000 and look back, I cover this in my book in greater detail, but they also did this with the global warming pause. Climate skeptics pointed out that, for almost 19 years, the temperatures remained stable from the El Nino in 1998. Well, what they did is they went back and they said, you know what, we decided that we had to cool the Arctic, and so therefore the pause no longer exists. It'd be like if you had a company that was losing money and you hired a new accountant and they said, hey, guess what? I redid the books. We now have record profits. That's what they're doing, manipulating climate data. And there's all sorts of examples of that. And it's just like Orwell's 1984, because the past is flexible and changeable. And of course, the future, as I mentioned with the polar bears, you can change that in a second. The polar bears could have a dire future just by making a scarier prediction. You can make a sea level prediction. Sea level is worse than we thought. Why? We just made a scarier prediction than we did last year. So it's worse. This is how they operate. It's very similar to Orwell's 1984. In fact, you add those lockdown, the COVID lockdown, climate emergency, and you can start seeing even more that sort of lurch toward technocracy, which we're heading directly into.
Yeah. Well, one of the most troubling aspects of the whole climate alarmist movement, I think, is the insistence on silencing skeptics. And you have a whole segment in Climate Hustle 2 on that. Rhode Island Democrat Senator Sheldon Whitehouse wants to use the RICO statute, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Law, against climate realists. And of course, that was meant to handle things like the mafia, not scientists who disagree with each other. Now, we're running out of time here. There's so much more in Climate Hustle 2 that our listeners would benefit from knowing. You reveal how the climate alarmists have captured our public schools, turning them into propaganda mills that are filling children with terror. One particularly stunning part is an ad by a group called Climate Action. I'm hoping that our producer may be able to show us a clip of that film, of that commercial. It's up on video.
Kids, just before you go, there's a brilliant idea in the air that I'd like to run by you. Now, it's called 10-10. The idea is everyone starts cutting their carbon emissions by 10%, thus keeping the planet safe for everyone, eventually. Now, this hasn't got to be a huge thing, but I would love it if you and your families would think about doing something.
What sort of thing, miss?
Well, like getting your dad to insulate the loft, or taking your next holiday by train instead of flying, or buying energy-saving light bulbs.
We're thinking of using our car less. I'm going to cycle to school.
That's fantastic, Jemima. Now, no pressure at all, but it'd be great to get a sense of how many of you might do this. Just a rough percentage. That's fantastic. And there's Nork. Philip and Tracy. That's fine. That's absolutely fine. Your own choice. Okay, class, thank you so much for today, and I will see you all tomorrow. Oh, just before you go, I just need to press this little button here. Now, everybody, please remember to read chapters 5 and 6 on volcanoes and glaciation. Except for Philip and Tracy, of course.
Mark, what does that reveal about the mentality of the more radical wing of the climate change
Gillian
movement?
Anderson. That was Gillian Anderson, the actress from the X-Files fame. And this was the group called 1010, a UK group. They thought this was funny. Now, keep in mind, they had already been calls for, as you mentioned, RICO statutes, jailing skeptics. Scientists have had their careers ruined. There's been calls for the death penalty. I've had multiple public calls to, for me to be, either imprisoned or killed. And other climate skeptics have been threatened to be killed publicly. Despite all of that, this group thought it would be funny to show that kids who don't go along, that peer pressure and that pressure of the campaigners, get their heads blown up and die in the classroom in as gory a way as possible. This blew up in their face. This had all sorts of corporate sponsors and credit cards and banks and the usual corporate, woke individuals. And they got freaked out by this. This video was quickly pulled. We had to save that video because they tried to, make it disappear. But it goes to the heart of this is what the climate campaigners, this is really a revealing video because it shows you, this is their mindset. If you don't go along with us, we got to get rid of you. We have to eliminate you. And how do we know that's their mindset? Tom Friedman, New York Times columnist, actually praised China's one-party system. He said they can get things done without essentially the messiness of democracy. The former UN chief, Cristina Figueres, said the same thing, praised China for its one-party rule. They love that model. And there's also something that's come out of China, that the social credit system, where basically you're a good citizen if you check all the boxes. And we're finding out that, with COVID as well. But the idea is if you don't go along with this green campaign, you're going to be a societal pariah, and you're lucky you're not charged as a racketeer under the RICO Act. And that's what they did here. And in this case, they just blew up their heads, but it backfired on them. And we, of course, kept that footage because it's a revealing moment to show what climate campaigners really think. Not that they want to blow kids up, but they want to silence and crush dissent. And that's what you see in that video.
That's incredibly disturbing. Remember, friends, you can receive Climate Hustle 2 on DVD as our thanks when you donate any amount to the Cornwall Alliance by the end of this month. Simply go to www.cornwallalliance.org, click the donate button, complete the donation form, and in the comments field, ask for Climate Hustle 2 and mention promo code 20-12. Mark, I wish we had a lot more time with you tonight. Maybe we can have you on again sometime. But for now, though, do you have any closing comments for our viewers, in particular, what they can do as a practical matter to prevent the rise of the climate monarchy?
Well, yes, good question. First of all, I just wanted to say, I wanted to make sure I mentioned Kevin Sorbo does a phenomenal job in this. He ties together and weaves this whole narrative together, from climate monarchy to 1984 to all the alleged wacky solutions. And we go through it. We go through it all. Kevin Sorbo recognizes the Hollywood. He does a great section, too, on how global warming has become a new religion. But to answer your question,
you could say he does a Herculean task.
He does a Herculean, yes. And he was great to work with.
He played Hercules, of course.
We shot on location down in Florida before the seas engulfed the whole state. So we got that in, and we missed that tipping point. We got in before that. But here's the way you have to fight this. We need people to tell the local officials and their national officials, their congressmen, senators, we need people to be able to stand up against this narrative. What we're finding, and the greatest challenge we face right now, is conservative Republican congressmen on Capitol Hill, who, from the Western Caucus and others, who should know better, are basically just either tired of it or intimidated into fighting the climate science debate. They're conceding the narrative. And they're actually coming up with what you could call as the Green New Deal light. Well, it's not that bad. They're becoming Me Too Republicans. In other words, not so fast, and eventually Me Too. Well, we could have been a lot worse. Thank God we got. I think we need to oppose this on its face. We don't need, in the words of Václav Klaus in the film, to be masterminded from above. If we did face a climate emergency, which is what they're all claiming, the last thing you'd want to do is turn over our American way of life, freedoms, innovation, technology, economic growth, and have it centrally planned by an elite group of experts who know better than us how we should live our lives. You would actually open up and open up all fields of research, innovation, and that's what we've been doing. That's why the United States is leading the world in reducing our emissions because of technological advancements like fracking. So in other words, you'd want to do the exact opposite. People need to get this message out. That not only is there is no climate emergency, but that if we face one, this is the exact opposite. The Green New Deal, UN, is the exact opposite of what we should be doing. We should be embracing freedom, technology, and allowing energy to compete. I believe, I'm not against renewable energy. I believe it could someday, but you cannot ban energy that works to mandate energy that's not ready for prime time. In other words, 3% of our global energy production comes from solar and wind in the United States. It hasn't changed in 100 years. 80+% come from fossil fuels. And they want to turn that 80%, they want it to disappear in the next 10 years, 15 years, depending on which plan. And they somehow want to just make this all magically happen. This is the greatest threat. It has nothing to do with climate. It's the greatest threat of the American way of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And just to see the smiling faces of the same activists. Remember, people like Jane Fonda, they show up every week in Washington lobbying for the Green New Deal, doing a climate protest. Guess what her comment was on the COVID lockdowns? COVID is God's gift to the left. And she actually said, I'm not supposed to be saying that, but COVID is God's gift to the left. That's all you need to know. This is the greatest threat we face. Make politicians who are ostensibly on our side, make them fight this on the premise and the narrative. Don't let them concede. That's one of the biggest things. And I would also say resist the lockdowns as much as possible, especially if you live in urban areas like New York or LA, where they're getting, because if they've, one of the biggest things about the Great Reset is the UK House of Lords Speaker said he was so shocked at how compliant the public was to these lockdowns. Yes. And it gives him hope in order to fight the climate emergency. So the less compliant we are on the COVID lockdowns, the less ambitious they're going to be on the climate lockdowns. We're facing the greatest threat to our liberty, bar none, bar nothing. And this happened virtually overnight with COVID, and it's going to morph into climate.
Marc Morano, thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's been a delightful time. You've done a delightful film, and we hope that a whole lot of our viewers will take advantage of the opportunity to get it as our gift whenever they make a donation of any size and ask for it at cornwallalliance.org. We appreciate your joining us tonight, and I wish you well. I wish you a Merry Christmas, and I wish the same to all of our viewers on From the Stacks. We will be back again after the first of the year. The next 2 Tuesdays, though, we're going to take off. But thanks very much, all of you, for joining us tonight. And may the Lord fill your Christmas and your New Year with the blessings of life and of liberty, and especially of the knowledge of Jesus Christ, our Lord and our Savior.